conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right. It's hour 3. And we've been slamming and jamming with you, the best listeners in satellite radio, 125 Patriot. We are here for you, and we're so glad you're here for us, here with us. 866-95-PATRIOT to join the program. Welcoming in Ethan Brown. He's a prolific writer and commentator on climate issues, founder and host of the Sweaty Penguin podcast, which is found at thesweatypenguin.com. Thank you so much, Ethan, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Stacy.
All right. So you are writing and discussing over at current.com a very interesting phenomenon. It's your commentary, climate anxiety, and how it's a serious problem.
Yeah, so I was speaking about some of the wildfires this summer, the fires in Canada, obviously the most recent case in Maui, which has been devastating. And I think that some of these stories, especially compounded with lots and lots of talk about climate change, can get a little overwhelming for especially my generation, but really anybody. Climate anxiety is a real issue. Lots and lots of people in Generation Z especially experience this. And while it's valid to be concerned, it shouldn't take away from the fact that we have solutions that we can implement around wildfires. And I wanted to be sure that in addition to talking about all of the issues, we talk about some of the solutions so we can try to prevent this moving forward.
So what preventative measures could we employ to stop climate fires? Is that what you're calling it? Or wildfires?
Yeah, it depends on the region, obviously, the forest, but there are a lot of strategies at our disposal. We can do logging, we can do controlled burns, we can clear out some of the brush that builds up in these forests. Furthermore, just education. 85% of wildland fires in the United States are caused by acts of human negligence, things like unattended campfires, cigarettes that you drop on the floor. So these are things that we can very easily correct for if we just don't do that. So I think that gives me a certain level of hope even in these devastating stories, because we can make a difference, and I hope we can talk about that more and do that.
Okay, so I don't disagree with, being more careful with our fire safety measures, clearing out underbrush, taking environmentally conscious actions to tend the garden, as it were, making sure that we keep the underbrush down. And these are common sense measures. Are there any other things you're proposing that would possibly help with this?
I think that, again, there's a variety of solutions, and we've seen these things work in the past. Often it was indigenous communities who were here and managing these forests and were able to do it quite successfully using many of these techniques. I think the real question becomes, how do we actually implement this stuff, right? Smokey the Bear has been around for almost 100 years, and people still don't know not to leave their campfire unattended. So figuring out how we educate people, how we make sure people actually embrace why these things are important, that's a challenge. And then also figuring out politically, right, where are the resources going to come from to do these forest management projects? How can we get them approved more quickly? Right now they often get held up in, believe it or not, environmental permitting limbo. So making sure that our process is actually helping the environment and not standing in the way of environmental protection. These are all good things to think about.
Sure. So you talk in your article about emphasizing the impact of human-caused climate change on wildfires. So what, and I understand the people not putting out their campfires, not attending to their campfires. I understand that. But there's also quite a bit of intentionally set fires that people are never prosecuted for. And we saw great evidence of this in Canada during the pandemic, when there was a lockdown, there was a marked decrease in the number of wildfires that caught on in Canada. And then once the pandemic was over and the lockdowns were over, the wildfires began again. So we could definitely correlate. That's not just accidental activity. That's intentional setting of wildfires, which is a crime. But we don't have any prosecutions on that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not personally familiar with that data, but I trust you, and I think that intentional arson is another major factor in this. And again, figuring out if we certainly, if something is a crime, we need to enforce that regulation, and also just educating people on why they shouldn't do that. I try to be hopeful and optimistic, and I hope that if people have the information and understand how these things can harm people, that maybe they would think twice before doing something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And that would be my hope as well, because I always would hope that people would not want to, for the sake of, fun or a thrill, set a fire that could end up destroying neighborhoods. And in the case in 2021, there were whole towns destroyed in California during that spate of wildfires. And so, this is very serious. You also talk in your article about climate anxiety, how serious a problem it is, as you've mentioned here. And you quoted Pew Research Center, which found that 51% of social media users said they felt anxious about the future after viewing climate content. So moderately negative emotions can inspire action, but many studies find overwhelming fear, anxiety, and guilt can actually lead people to disengage from a cause. Do you feel like the amount of kind of hysteria surrounding climate change and climate action actually matches up with some of the other issues that Americans are really concerned with, like namely the high cost of food, shortages in drugs and medication, and the uptick in crime?
I think it does. It depends on who you talk to, of course. And I think sometimes climate change can even affect some of these other issues we care about, be it high food prices, economic issues in general. And I think that the climate anxiety piece is something that I work in my career to try to address. I think that it's more than just the hysteria from a lot of young people. It can also be people who become very skeptical of climate change because there's just too much to look at and it can be hard to process. People who feel that we can't do anything and get scared and disengage. I think there's a lot of ways that this feeling of fear or anxiety or skepticism can kind of play out. What I always try to do is, first off, lead with the science, think about everything as critically as we possibly can, talk to experts, but then really try to explore solutions and spotlight solutions and think about how these things could be solved from all different angles so that people from any background or political perspective can listen to our content and see, I like this idea, I don't like that idea, start to give a path forward. It gives hope, it gives common ground. That's really what my work is all about.
So I can appreciate that. I'll have to tell you, I don't get that from most people who join me here on the program to talk about climate change. They don't have a balanced approach. They don't see it in a host of issues facing Americans, and they certainly aren't willing to kind of assume the best for people who are really not engaged on this topic. I find much of it to be it's hysterical, which is why I don't really like in normatively, like when I'm thinking, who do I want to talk to? What do I want to talk about? It's not climate activists, because there's rarely a thoughtful discussion to be had. And certainly if there are questions or if there's any dissent at all, it seems to inflame things to a degree to where there can't be anything productive. And so it's a welcome, refreshing opportunity tonight to talk to you and to hear your ideas, and to hear that you're talking about the holistic approach, meaning there are some activities that humans engage in, namely not watching their campfires, not being careful when utilizing fire in areas that are dry. And I think the other story that also was big tonight is reporting out of Maui that shows that they had some preventative measures that they could have taken to make Lahaina less susceptible to a huge fire like what happened, and they only got through a few of the suggestions from the report. So if they had followed through on the majority of it, the fire wouldn't have been as big and it could have been contained, and they might not have had such a massive loss of life or property. So these are all considerations as well.
Absolutely. I'm always here to talk, Stacy. If you want to talk climate, this is what I love to do. But I think in Maui, they're not just that report, which I saw as well, which was very concerning, but there were decades of malpractice where colonizers were bringing over buffalo grass and molasses grass and guinea grass to feed the cattle that they also brought over. And these species are very drought resistant. They took over from all the native species, and it led to once agriculture kind of slowed down on the island in favor of tourism, these species spread everywhere. Now a quarter of the island is covered in these species that just are tinderboxes for when a wildfire like this happens, especially when Maui was also facing a flash drought, hotter temperatures, and Hurricane Dora to the south. All of these things just combined in the worst possible way. But this is something that happens everywhere. We know how to do these solutions. We know how to do these preventative measures, but they can get caught up in the permitting process where we just can't get the project approved, and by the time we do, another fire has already happened. So we need to figure out ways to not just do these solutions, but get them implemented more quickly.
Yeah. So when you were talking about the people who brought over these invasive species, which I'm pretty sure that's against the law, there must have been laws that are broken there. You said that they were colonizers. Who are the colonizers? Because we're talking about Hawaii, which is already a part of the United States.
Yeah, so this was going back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, prior to Hawaii becoming a U.S. state. It was actually, I was reading the other day a report from, I believe it was U.S. Forest Service or one of the government agencies from, I think, the 1950s that was talking about how great it would be if we bring over these new species because they're more drought resistant, and so they'll grow more, and it'll be better for the cattle to have this reliable food source, and they're more nutritious and whatever. They had no idea what they were doing, obviously. It was kind of shocking to read this old primary source there. So, now we know why we can't do that, and that's why it's not legal. But at the time,
so this was a long time
it was
ago.
A good idea, and now we face the consequence.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. Now that they've had so much of the land there burned, I wonder if they'll go in and maybe eradicate those species, or if it's even possible.
At this point, it would be tough. And again, these species are incredibly fire resistant. They will thrive on what just happened these last 2 weeks. So certainly the more we could clear out and replace with native species, I don't even know where to start because it's already a quarter of the island covered in these grasses.
Wow. And I read in the report that they're dry. It's like tinderbox. And that was what was the big determiner of the spread, that and the wind, that's what made it spread so quickly and become so unmanageable.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about climate change for a second, we know that we don't know the specific link yet between climate change and this specific fire, and that's something that scientists can determine, but it's a little more tricky with a wildfire than, say, an extreme heat event. But we do know that climate change creates hotter, drier, more disease-prone conditions in forests. Specifically here, there was research just this year showing that climate change has led to more flash droughts, which is what happened in Maui, where it just dried up within a few weeks. And we also know that climate change can make hurricanes stronger, which is what we saw south of Maui. Hurricane Dora it actually broke some records in the Pacific Ocean for hurricanes and typhoons. So
what is
we
the
know
proof
that
that the hurricane
exacerbates this,
but what is the proof that it exacerbates it?
So there's a few reasons. In this case, I would say the primary factor is warmer temperatures create more energy. If we took high school physics or chemistry, you might have heard the phrase heat is energy. So when there's more heat in the ocean, when there's more heat in the air above the ocean, once a storm system has started, it will pick up speed a lot more quickly. So that's why we see these hurricanes increasingly with these record-breaking wind speeds, because of that warmer temperature. There are some other factors too, but in the case of this fire, that would be the main one that I would suspect would have affected things.
But I understand that. I did take high school physics. The question I'm asking is, what proof is there that climate change is the cause of the heat wave that we're experiencing this summer, when about 100 years ago, 180 years ago, we had a record-breaking, it was a heat wave, and we have a record of it and how long it lasted. And that happened during a time where there were no combustion engines, no fossil fuel burning things. It was just a totally different country then, and we had a heat wave then. And if you go back through history, you'll find other heat waves during times where we did not have anthropological climate change, according to the models and the discussion that are currently being used surrounding this topic. So how do we know definitively that we have warmer temperatures, that this heat wave is driven by a phenomenon, a quantifiable phenomenon that is known currently as climate change? It used to be global warming, then it was global cooling, now it's climate change. How do we know that?
So there's a number of reasons. For one, we understand the greenhouse effect, which is carbon dioxide, methane, some other gases are structured in such a way where when infrared radiation hits them, they sort of wobble and they retain energy and pass energy to each other, and it kind of creates this blanket effect over the planet. It's similarly why Venus is so hot, because it has all these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we know that activities that we do, like fossil fuel combustion, can release these gases, and these gases have that heat trapping effect. We also know, going back through history, of course, climate has changed a lot, and there are a lot of reasons why, be it changes in solar activity, changes in volcanic activity, an asteroid hitting and killing the dinosaurs, but also sending a ton of dust into the air and causing an ice age. We know these things happen, and we know that if we look at each one of these other causes, from like 1950 onwards, solar activity has been pretty stagnant. Volcanic activity has been less, if anything. So there are other variations that happen. For instance, we just transitioned into a El Nino event this summer that is part of what caused a lot of these records, but we do know that climate change played a major role as well.
So I don't really feel like you gave me, any definitive reasons that I could take and say, oh, I just spoke to someone who's an activist in this arena, and here are the reasons why we know that this heat wave this summer was anthropologically caused. Human activity caused it. And the other thing about that we use these, fossil fuels and what have you, the issue there is that the United States, at 340 million people, even with our land mass, which is considerable, we're such a tiny fraction of the contributing force on the planet to any kind of emissions. We have the cleanest energy sources. We have the cleanest production of energy. All of our production facilities, for whether we're talking about coal or liquefied natural gas or fracking, all of ours are the cleanest. All of our industries are the cleanest. We have the toughest regulations on any industry that might spill or contaminate anything. And so as a population of 340 million, and we're competing against mega countries like India, China, all of these countries that don't have the same level of cleanliness in their industries, there is no way for us to offset, no matter what we do, no matter how much money we send out of here, and the American taxpayers can't afford another burden, we can't offset the emissions that are not being adhered to by the nation state of China, let alone China, India, and Pakistan. So how do we actually, with a straight face, say to American taxpayers who are already burdened with, now we have a new child, it's called Ukraine, 150 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars going there. And all of the other things that Americans have to pay for, the tax burden is so high. We've already given up our light bulbs, washing machines don't work, toilets barely flush. Everything that we had that used to work well has been Energy Star certified into almost non-working things. And we're still being told we have to sacrifice more. And last I checked, most of the meteorologists, no matter how hard they try, they can't tell me what the weather will be this weekend. So we don't actually know that the heat wave is caused by human activity or climate change. There's just no way to quantify it and point directly from a cause that human beings are actioning to weather changes. We can't pinpoint it. We can't say in 2 days the weather will be such and such and it will be this much hotter or colder or this much more volatile because these sections of America are all driving fossil fuel vehicles. We just can't do that.
There's a few questions in there. I'll try to take as many as I can as quickly as I can. So on the point about attributing human-caused climate change to individual events, of course, climate change and weather are two very different things. We can't figure out the weather perfectly in advance, but we can, as you know, we know that it's pretty cold up at the North Pole all the time. We know it's warm by the equator all the time. Climate is less about day to day and more about long-term trends. So we understand
we don't even predict those correctly. I just have to jump in because I've actually heard this before from other people who are climate activists, and we don't have the ability to even predict long-term what will happen, because when I was a child 42 years ago, they were saying that before I reached adulthood, we would have an ice age. They also said that the entire planet would be submerged in water by the year 2012. There are all these predictions that have been made by climatologists about the catastrophic effects of global warming, global cooling, a potential ice age, all of these things. You can find the headlines in the newspapers from when I was a child all the way up until just recently, and everyone's always in a hysteria about it, in a panic, and none of these things have happened. When President Obama was elected, he said that the ice at the northern cap of the North Pole, that ice was going to be almost gone if we didn't do something about climate change. By the time he was done serving his second term, he bought a house on Martha's Vineyard. No one buys beachfront property if they think that the ice caps are melting and that all of Manhattan and the outer rim of New York, that all of that property is going to be underwater. Nobody does that. So I think there's obviously we should be responsible. Obviously, we should recycle. We should care for our climate, for our environment, for our country, for all of these things. It's responsible stewardship is a must. But we're already doing the most that we possibly can. And I feel like if we can't show a cause and effect, how are we supposed to convince people that this is important?
I totally understand and empathize with all of that. I think it's the Martha's Vineyard thing is just as bizarre to me as it is to you. In terms of, first off, I'll talk about what we can do moving forward, because I think that's an important point you alluded to with having to work together with other countries. Here in the U.S., our emissions have dropped about 16% since 2005, just naturally via the way we've developed our technologies, a little bit of policy, I guess, but really just the way that people have chosen to do things more cleanly, not necessarily because it's better for the climate, but because it's better economically. That's something that really excites me, and we're on track to continue doing that just because it's better economically. So obviously there are a lot of different avenues you can take policy-wise, but it doesn't have to be a sacrifice. It can be something where we improve the environment and improve the economy at the same time, regardless of the climate conversation, which I know can get very sciencey and overwhelming. We all want clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment, and we all want a strong economy and to have good lives. I think there are ways that we can do all of that at the same time without sacrificing, but developing and improving. I'm happy to talk more about the cause and effect stuff if you'd like, but I think, honestly, regardless of the climate, a lot of these things are just better technologies, save people money, grow the economy, and that's really why I get excited about my work.
Well, I have to tell you, your last statement there, that's thing that I can get on board with that all day, every day, because I believe in recycling. We actually pay extra to do it here. We've always done it. Every single family home we've ever lived in, every apartment building we've ever lived in or owned, we've always recycled. I always recycle our batteries and our televisions. We believe in care of the environment. I just don't think we should set policy around it that would slow down the economy or make it difficult for people to live their lives. And it sounds like you're one of those common sense people who you not only can have a conversation, but you can advocate for policy that helps people instead of hindering, because it's small businesses that are really hurt by extra regulations. Big businesses can hire lawyers and CPAs to figure out ways around it. Little businesses just go out of business when regulation becomes very heavy. I know that we probably could go back and forth, on the actual climate, like how and the back and forth of the whys. But I think your last statement was definitive in that you're operating from a place of common sense. And I totally respect that. I think it's so great. It's so great to have a conversation with someone who is actually caring about both sides of this equation. So it's great to have you here, and tell everyone how to find the Sweaty Penguin Pod, because it sounds great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you saying that, and I fully agree. I never try to advocate anything that would make people's lives worse. That's the last thing I want to do, and the reason I'm in this conversation is to try to follow the science, but also try to make people's lives better. So really appreciate that. You can find the Sweaty Penguin wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc. We're also at pbs.org/ParalympPromise or thesweatypenguin.com. You can find me on social media at EthanBrown5151. And yeah, thanks again for having me. Happy to come back anytime.
All right. Well, we look forward to talking to you again. Until then, everybody, Sweaty Penguin Pod, wherever you get your podcasts, check it out. And thank you, Ethan. Have a wonderful weekend. I know it's a little early, but have a great weekend.
You too, Stacy.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Sweaty Penguin Pod, which sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to be checking it out over the weekend because we have a drive to do. So we'll take calls on the other side of this break. 866-957-2874. We'll be right back.